Okay, we're looking at the end of Book 9, Paradise Lost, and we'll move on to Book 10 as well. But we left off in Book 9, and I don't want to leave that. The fall hadn't even happened, so I can't deal with Paradise Lost and not deal with the fall. That would be not just remiss, that would be unforgivable. So we'll pick it up. Where shall we pick it up? Trying to remember where we left it off. Not sure, but let me pick it up with the description here, and it's because it will, and then I'll jump forward. But description in line 626. We're in the middle of the temptation, and Eve is being deceived by the serpent. We're told that she's amazed. That's a term that's repeatedly used. So, and think of it as being lost in a maze, because that's what his words are doing. She's following him, and she's following him down paths that are leading her astray, as if walking through a maze. And in 626, as a consequence of this, the wily adder, Milton writes, blithe and glad, says, Empress, the way is ready, because she's just said, lead me to this wonderful tree you've been talking about. The way is ready and not long, beyond a row of myrtles on a flat, fast by a fountain, one small thicket past of blowing myrrh and balm. If thou accept my conduct, I can bring thee thither soon. Reference to myrtle here is interesting and poignant. As throughout Paradise Lost, there are the mythological references. If we don't know the myths, can seem just like unnecessary decoration, and you wish that he would get rid of some of it. In this case, it will allude to the myth related to myrtles, which is that of Venus. So Venus is the figure that is associated with myrtles, because in mythological reckoning, Venus, the goddess of love on the island of Cythera, which she's sometimes called, was ashamed to show herself because she was naked. Now, she was always naked. For some reason, she was ashamed of this and hid herself behind a myrtle tree. Now, the reason this is relevant here is simply because this is unfallen Eve, but he's leading her beyond a row of myrtles, and it's anticipating the fallen state of Eve after the fall, so where she will be ashamed of her nakedness, just as Venus was. So she likewise is naked in the garden. She's unashamed as of yet. But being led down by a row of myrtles, Milton is dramatically foreshadowing the consequence of the fall that's just about to happen. Now, this is subtle on Milton's part, and it's characteristic of the imagery that Milton uses. So it's not just arbitrary, his use of images and myths, and even plants and flowers. I just wanted to draw that to your attention. I won't say anything more about that, but that sort of dramatic foreshadowing of the fall has been taking place throughout the epic. And one of the reasons he does this is he's not worried that we're in any doubt about what's going to happen, because it's already happened. There's a historical record of it in the Bible, and he assumes all of his readers have read the Bible and know about the fall of mankind. So we're not on the edge of our seats wondering if Satan's going to get, he's going to succeed. In fact, so much so that God's already predicted he's going to succeed. So there's no drama in what will actually transpire. The drama is in the telling of what we already know is going to happen. So let me move on with that said. So we'll skip forward to, so he leads her, she says, lead on. He takes her to the tree of prohibition, and in 647 to 54, she says, you know, you may have spared us this. It says, of the fruit of each tree, 6:59, we may eat, but of the fruit of this fair tree amidst the garden, God hath said, ye shall not eat thereof, nor shall ye touch it, lest ye die. That's where I left off, I recall now. And as I said last class, that is a direct quotation from Scripture, but in Scripture, note that that is not actually what God said. You're not supposed to eat of it, but there's no reference to touching. So this is an additional prohibition. And how Adam and Eve comes to understand that not touching the fruit is also prohibited, we don't know. We're left to infer. It's clearly not from God, at least on the basis of what we have in the text. Is it because Adam has said, well, don't even touch it, just stay away from it? Excessive caution? Let's just not even, possibly. It seems to add a strength to the prohibition and a little bit more unreasonable. You can't even touch it, whereas eating it is consuming it, making it part of yourself. Like when we eat things and consume them, the organic matter of what we eat becomes a part of the organic matter of our body, so it becomes part of us. Touching it does not do that. So it seems a little bit more unreasonable, and maybe that's part of the wedge that Satan uses in the temptation. We're not really clear, because actually in the Genesis account, it's not particularly persuasive. We're not being given what Milton gives us here, which is a sort of sense of how Eve, as imperious in her reasoning powers was nonetheless able to be led astray by Satan. How is that even possible? And I say Genesis 3 verses 1 to 6, it's so short that it's almost impossible to believe. It happened. And here's the thrust of what was said. We're not being given recorded speech or even little extracts from it, just in the same way we're never given Jesus' whole sermons on the Mount. We're given synopsis of them, the essence of them crystallized there. So Milton is simply repeating that, but then Satan now pulls his final rabbit out of the hat, which is to act as a humanitarian at the prohibition. So she scarce had said, though brief, when now more bold the tempter, but with show of zeal and love to man, and indignation at his wrong, new part puts on, and as to passion moved, fluctuates, disturbed yet comely, and an act raised as of some great matter to begin, as when of old some orator renowned in Athens or free Rome, where eloquence flourished, since mute, to some great cause addressed, stood in himself collected, while each part, motion, each act, one audience ere the tongue, sometimes in height began, as no delay of preface brooking through his zeal of right. In standing, moving, or to height of groan, the tempter all impassioned thus began. So he puts on the air of indignation and moral wrong. He's indignant. The passion, he's going to move her. Now what he is doing is trying to get her in her natural organism to demonstrate the causes or the consequences of the fall before the fall has happened. In other words, to let your passion and your will overrule your reason. Because the reason is supposed to inform the will what to do. Your passion should not lead you on this. Your desire to eat the food in front of you and the benefits that it will allegedly supply. So he's appealing to her passions, and he does it by becoming impassioned. This will only work if the moral integrity of the orator is unquestioned, by the way. So it is orators, when they stand up in public, they will often speak in an impassioned way, and they move their audience as a consequence of that. That only works if the orator is a morally trustworthy individual, and they will assent to being moved. Otherwise, it's just this guy's going on, and I can see that he's manipulating, and nobody's falling for it. But she trusts Satan because he can say, look at me, look at what's happened to me. And I want you to benefit from it as well. You can become greater than you are. After all, isn't that what God set you in the garden to do? Make Eden everywhere, to improve things. You're supposed to cultivate it. Well, why not cultivate yourself? And he forbade you this, knowing that it would lead to this outcome. Now in Paradise, or in Paralandra, Lewis will play on this hugely by saying the reason he prohibited it was so that you would transgress it and become mature and demonstrate maturity by throwing off your dependence upon him. That's not what Milton does here. He just is outraged on her behalf that God has prohibited from her something that will improve her and make her more like God. And after all, she knows that she was made like God. It's been repeated by everyone. In fact, the fairest image of her maker fair she is. So he first begins by then praising the plant, O sacred, wise, and wisdom-giving plant, mother of science. So this is the basis for all knowledge. Remember, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So when he calls it the mother of science, that's the Latin word for knowledge, scientia. And that's the name of the tree. And is it not good to know more things? Is God trying to keep her in ignorance? I know in popular discussions of this tree, even in churches, it's often called the tree of knowledge. That's not actually what the tree is called. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't shorten it. In Gnostic myths, that is their understanding here. It's the tree of knowledge, and gnosis is knowledge. So that breaking the prohibition was a good thing. It's a secret knowledge. It was hidden. Now it's been revealed. It's not the tree of knowledge. Adam had all knowledge. We've just seen that in books 7 and 8. He's been demonstrated. He's named things, so he knows what they are. And his knowledge is accurate and full. Not complete like God's, but nonetheless. So this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now what that means, we're going to have to come to that, because a lot hangs on what we mean by that thing. When they come to do evil, do they know something, a discrete entity that is, we will call evil? Or is, and I'll give it away, is evil actually just the privation of good? Is it the absence of things that are solid and real? Is it the hollowing out of things that were already good? And I think that's what's meant by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They will learn what evil is by feeling and knowing what has been lost. They will know their loss. That is what they will know, and they will call that loss evil, because it is evil. But it's not evil unto itself. It's evil because it's a loss of something, and the something is the good. So they've lost something of the good. We call that evil. So and Milton is consistent in his Augustinian portrait of evil in this book. And if you're going to try and follow him, you have to be consistent in as well. And I recommend, and I have done this already, C.S. Lewis's the preface to Paradise Lost. He talks about St. Augustine in here, and his discussion of the nature of evil as the privatio boni, the privation of the good, is essential. So evil is not a thing. Satan is a being created by God. His being is something good about him still. He opposes God, but he is not a contrary evil power. That's called Manichaeanism. That's a heresy. He's a good being who has rebelled against God, and he's losing his essence as a consequence. And he's placed in this underworld called hell, where there is no light, but rather darkness visible. So that's the privation of light. Light being a theological expression of God's goodness. So he praises this plant as the mother of science, and he says, "Now I feel thy power within me clear, not only to discern things in their causes, but to trace the ways of highest agents." In other words, now he knows God's plan. In other words, he claims to be God. Not only trace things in their causes, but of the highest agents, deemed, however, wise. Queen of this universe, do not believe those rigid threats of death. Ye shall not die. How should ye? By the fruit it gives you life to knowledge. That's what life means. Life to knowledge. He's redefined life. He's redefined God. Note that in debates, the person that defines the terms wins the argument. If you didn't know that, then start. If you want to win an argument, define the terms. If you let your opponent define the terms, you're going to lose the argument, because the conclusions will fall naturally from the terms that have already been defined. So I'm going to talk about this after class next week for the Sophia Society, human rights. What do we mean by human, and what do we mean by rights? You got to define the terms, right? We can't assume that we know what we're talking about here. And once we have defined it, then we can make an argument, but not before. And that's what a liberal arts education is supposed to do. We first must understand what we're talking about, and then we'll talk. Don't talk and then figure it out. You start by understanding, because we're talking about the truth here, not opinion or conjecture. So he says that she will not die, and he says, what is the fruit? It gives you life to knowledge. So now life is in relation to the thing that she desires and that he says he's attained, rather than life which is given by God. And God is life. And to be alive is to be in relation to God. And what he's proposing to her is that she do something that will sever her relation to God. And thereby, naturally, as a consequence, she will die. Because to turn away from life is to die. She can do anything. She's free to do anything, but to disobey is to sever her relationship with God. But he redefines what life is. Life is, it's a life to knowledge. And of course, the knowledge is a means to an end. So she's seizing means as ends. Becomes a pragmatist. By the threatener. So will you die by the threatener? Well, look on me. Me who have touched and tasted. Yet both live, and life more perfect have attained than fate meant me, by venturing higher than my lot. Shall that be shut to man? So here's the proof. I'm not dead. See with your own eyes. She can see he's not dead by any understanding of death, at least by any consequential understanding of death. But if life is in relation to God and he's Satan and he opposes God, then he's already, in one sense, dead. He's dead in his sins. He's dead in his relations to God. He has no living relationship with God whatsoever, other than being God's drudge. Right? So he's redefined the term. Once he's done that, if she accepts his presentation, she's dead, which is true. She is. She's just about to become. So, and they'll give all sorts of reasons for it. Look at me, I'm not dead. And after they eat the fruit, by the way, Adam and Eve, they'll say, oh, maybe it's not true because we're not dead. Satanic logic. To this day, people could say, the wages of sin are death, and we're sinners. Okay, but we're not dead. I'm alive. So it's not true. I see people, I will accept that people are sinning. They do bad things. We're still living. And everyone, whether they're a Christian or not, dies, right? So what's this talk about sin leading invariably to death? Not true. It's that sort of argument on appearance. So you need to define your terms. Shall that be shut to man, which the beast is open? That would be an injustice in itself. So a lower creature can benefit from this fruit and a higher creature cannot? One that bears the image of God? Or will God incense his ire for such a petty trespass, and not praise rather your dauntless virtue, whom the pain of death denounced, whatever thing death be, deterred not from achieving what might lead to happier life, knowledge of good and evil? Of good? How just? Of evil? If what is evil be real, why not known, since easier shunned? There's the argument. This is the dualistic argument, a Manichaean argument. You will know good by evil. You'll know good better by evil. It's a Manichaean argument, by the way. It's not Christian. It's not only sub-Christian, it's anti-Christian. You will not know good by evil. You will know good by good. Good is a thing. It's the reality of the whole universe. God created it. It's good. We know things that are good. They're real things. Things that he calls good. Evil is the privation of those things. We can note those as well. When we come to describe a bad person, how do we describe them? They're lacking in this and this and that. And the consequence is this and this and that. But these are not things unto themselves. They're a lack of something that they ought to have. So if they're not, so we'll say they're not loving. They're unjust. They're intemperate. They're cowardly, whatever. Well, these are the absence of the good things, or the privation of the good things. And we will say those things are evil. Abusive. Well, we don't use things rightly. That's abuse. It's a negative term. It begs the question, well, what's the positive? So good defines the evil and not the other way around. Don't fall into... Because if the opposite is true, then you need to do bad things in order to become knowledgeable of everything. That means you better start setting on a lot of things. You don't need any encouragement to do that, by the way. It's called original sin. It inclines you towards it anyway, but don't let your intellect be deceived on that front. So he presents a series of specious arguments here. And in the end of it, he said, ye shall be as gods. Ye eat thereof, your eyes shall, that seem so clear, yet are but dim, shall perfectly be then opened and cleared, and ye shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil, as they know, they being the gods, saying that they're multiple. That ye should be as gods, since I, as man, internal man, is but proportion meet. So it makes a logical argument from inference. I of brute human, ye of human God. Step up the ladder of the great chain of being. I moved up. You can hear me speaking just like a human being making rational arguments. Internally, you will be internally like a God as a consequence. So ye shall die, perhaps, by putting off human to put on gods. There's what we mean by death. It keeps redefining it. You'll die to your old self and you'll put on a new self. Well, does this not sound like a parody of Christian theology? That's because it is. And that's what Satan does. He parodies and mocks and dissembles. He seems good. So shall ye die, perhaps, by putting off human to put on God's death, to be wished, though threatened, which no worse than this can bring. And what are gods that man may not become as they, participating godlike food? The gods are first, and that advantage use on our belief, that all from them proceeds. I question it, for this fair earth I see, warmed by the sun, producing every kind. Them, nothing. I don't see the gods. They're not doing anything. I see the sun. It's doing it. The sun may be a god, not them. If they all things produced, who enclosed knowledge of good and evil in this tree? That whoso eats thereof forthwith attains wisdom without their leave? And wherein lies the offense, that man should thus attain to know? What can your knowledge hurt him? Or the street. So all of and note that it's just a barrage of argumentation, all of which are quite potent arguments in and of themselves. Just singly, and he is accumulating them. They're all based on false assumptions, but they sound persuasive. And then he concludes by praising her for the thing that she wants to be most. God is humane. Reach then and freely taste. He appeals in the end to her freedom. I remember Milton's God in Book 3 said, that he created them free until they enthrall themselves. And this is the point where the one last act of freedom that Eve makes is to choose no longer to be free. He ended, and his words replete with guile, filled with guile, into her heart too easy entrance won. Fixed on the fruit she gazed, which to behold might tempt alone. And in her ears the sound yet rung of his persuasive words, impregned with reason, to her seeming, and with truth. Meanwhile the hour of noon drew on, and waked an eager appetite, raised by the smell so savory of that fruit, which with desire inclinable now grown to touch or taste, solicited her longing eye, yet first pausing a while thus to herself she mused. So note now even her body seems to be trying to overturn her reason, her desires. She's hungry. Can smell the fruit. She already desires it intellectually, but her body's also pushing for it. Now, this is a difficult thing for Milton to present, because again, this is unfallen Eve. Her body has not yet overthrown, her passions have not yet overthrown her reason or her will. And so he has to portray an unfallen being committing an act of transgression, which is hard to imagine. And I just think he does a very good and persuasive job of presenting it. I think it's quite effective. So did C.S. Lewis, and Lewis does something similar in Perelandra. Second to this, but good. So then she speaks to herself. Now she's isolating herself. She's showing a consequence of the fall already in her thinking. She doesn't think about God. She doesn't think about Adam. She thinks about herself. She's acting already. The privation of the good has started to set in so far as she's not thinking about anyone else but herself. So that's the maze she's lost in. Great are thy virtues, doubtless best of fruits, though kept from man. That the way she frames it already seems like she's been unfairly treated. It's been kept from us. And worthy to be admired. So she starts persuading herself with all sorts of bad logic. Whose taste too long forborne at first to say gave elocution to the mute, and taught the tongue not made for speech to speak thy praise. That's not even true, because he didn't praise God. Actually, no, thy praise, she's referring to the tree. Okay, so now that she's personified the tree, by the way, thou is a personal pronoun of intimacy. She's speaking to the plant as an intimate being. It shows the degradation of her thought already. You and I are thous to God. We speak of God as a thou, an intimate address of persons. We speak of plants as an it. When you speak to a plant as a thou, you got issues. So she's displaced her right relation of personal intimacy to God and to Adam for a personal intimate relation to a plant. More than a figure of speech here, more than simply personification, it reflects an intellectual idolatry. You're wanting something from the plant that no plant can provide for you. Intimacy. So again, all of these are, as I said, in relation to the word myrtle and the tree, all of these are dramatic foreshadowings of the fall before the fall happens. They're not the effect of the fall. Milton will amplify the illogic of her arguments after she falls, but there's already traces of illogic here in what she says. And he's forced to do that, otherwise it doesn't become credible to the reader. So she takes it, eats it, imagines herself becoming more godlike. And the famous line 780, so saying, her rash hand in evil hour forth reaching to the fruit, she plucked, she eat. Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing through all her works, gave signs of woe that all was lost. Pathetic fallacy is the literary device. Here it's not a literary device. It is a literary device, but it's actually a literal description. Because when mankind falls, all of nature falls with him. Because he's made from the dust. Right? And we know the consequence of original sin is a fallen world. So it's not pathetic fallacy. Normally we would call this pathetic fallacy. It's going to be extended, by the way, when Adam transgresses and the sky drops bits of rain like tears. Same use, we would call that pathetic fallacy. Well, in this case, it's a fallen creation exhibiting the signs of a fallen creation. So it's a literal description. It's appropriate here. Anyway, so she did this, and she greedily, nor was Godhead from her thought, 790. Greedily she engorged without restraint, already showing the consequences of sin. There's no moderation now. She doesn't eat in order to fuel her body. She does it to fill it to the bursting. Lust. The lust of the eye and the lust of the flesh and the Godhead and the pride of life that follows from it. We'll come to that when we look at the 3 temptations in Paradise Regained. But greedily she engorged without restraint and knew not eating death. Satiate at length and heightened as with wine. So she's lost her senses, jocund and boon. Thus to herself she pleasingly gave. And what does she do? O sovereign, virtuous, precious of all trees in paradise. Praises it as a god, demonstrating her intellectual fall. She's praising a tree instead of God. First thing she does, speaks to it as a sovereign. Thereby she is little better than a tree worshiper. And then there are all sorts of thoughts here that she has. One of them is, she speaks very personally, and then suddenly it occurs to her. Just the thought outside of herself for the first time. And it starts with Adam. She doesn't think about how God will receive this. She starts with Adam. Now, she ought to have thought first about God, because that was the primary rebellion. But she thinks first of Adam, and I'll read it from 8:16. But to Adam, in what sort shall I appear? And she thinks about manipulating it. Shall I to him make known as yet my change, and give him to partake full happiness with me? Or rather not, but keep the odds of knowledge in my power, without co-partner. I'll have something over him. I'll be wiser than he, more knowledgeable, more godlike. Why? So to add what wants in female sex, the more to draw his love. He'll love me more when I'm superior to him. And render me more equal. And perhaps a thing not undesirable, sometimes superior. I love that line, more equal.
Is that an oxymoron?
Of course. Contradiction. She in her own argumentation, she contradicts herself all over the place, just like Satan does. It's the effect of satanic action is satanic logic. I want equality with Adam. Actually, she doesn't. She wants him to serve her and love her and adore her. It's the Galadriel. She wants to be Galadriel. That's what she wants. Loved and despaired. He has to love me. He won't freely love me. He will be compelled by my divinity. Perhaps a thing not undesirable, sometimes superior. For inferior, who is free? There's the line. That's satanic. Remember, Satan rebels against the very idea of a hierarchy because he's not at the top of it, and he thinks he ought to be. And there is an injustice in this. Now let me read these words on hierarchy from C.S. Lewis, because I think this is one of the chief problems that people have in reading Paradise Lost. And I'm going to begin with a little funny, again, C.S. Lewis, chapter 11 on hierarchy. He says that Johnson has complained that Milton thought men made only for rebellion and women only for obedience. That's funny. Well, I think it's funny. You didn't think it was funny. And then others, and you've probably read this, others assume that since he was a rebel against the monarchy of the Stuarts, he must also have been a rebel against the monarchy of God and secretly of the devil's party. Well, that's the romantic position. So Paradise Lost is a political allegory. That's what it is. And in fact, it's read that way very commonly in where Milton is now read, which is not everywhere, where it's a political allegory about the unjust nature of hierarchy. Lewis says this is a complete misunderstanding. Now, I'll read a whole paragraph here because I don't want to interrupt it. But he says that hierarchy is inherent in the universe, and everything except God has some natural superior. Everything except God. Everything except unformed matter has some natural inferior. So unformed matter, there's nothing below that. There's nothing above God, but otherwise there's a hierarchy. We're above something and we're below something. The goodness, happiness, and dignity of every being consists in obeying its natural superior and ruling its natural inferiors. When it fails in either part of this twofold task, so when we fail to treat animals as our natural inferiors and over whom we have dominion, there are problems with that. Or if we treat the earth as something that we don't have dominion over and that it ought to be let to go and be natural, problems ensue from this. Or if we rebel against God and say we don't need to give accountability to God, problems ensue for this. So one's a rebellion against what's below us and one's a rebellion against what's above us. Both of them are failing to recognize that there's a hierarchy of being in nature, plainly. So he says, if we fail in either part of this twofold task, we have disease or monstrosity in the scheme of things until the peccant thing, the sinful being, is either destroyed or corrected. One or the other it will certainly be, for by stepping out of its place in the system, whether it step up like a rebellious angel or down like an uxorious husband, Adam's sin, it has made the very nature of things its enemy. It cannot succeed. So it's a rebellion against natural law. When Adam obeys his wife, he has obeyed something that he is meant to rule over. When he disobeys God, he has rebelled against something that he is to be obedient to. It happens both ways. The two happen at the same time. Now I'll go on and read. Aristotle tells us that to rule and to be ruled are things according to nature. The soul is the natural ruler of the body. The male of the female, the reason of passion. Slavery is justified because some men are to other men as souls are to bodies. We must not, however, suppose that the rule of... Now this is important here. We must not, however, suppose that the rule of master over slave or soul over body is the only kind of rule. This is the important point. And I say this because nowadays, whenever there's the discussion of hierarchy, any discussion of hierarchy, we get what is called the master-slave dialectic from Rousseau, which is its total authority for one and no authority for the other. It's all or nothing. So if anyone is given authority, that means the other has no power, no authority, nothing. They have no humanity. For someone to have natural authorities, for other people to have no humanity at all. That's how we read it. That's the romantic take on it, by the way. It's Rousseau's position. It's called the master-slave dialectic. Look it up. I'm not reading from Lewis, though. It's just my comment. I'll go back to Lewis now. So again, we must not, however, suppose that the rule of master over slave or soul over body is the only kind of rule. There are many kinds of rule, as there are kinds of superiority or inferiority. So therefore, thus, a man should rule his slaves despotically. Do it. Do this. Do that. You don't ask, you tell. That's despotically. The consent of the governed is not asked. His children monarchically, like a king with his subjects in mind. And his wife politically. So there are differences there. but that doesn't say that there isn't a hierarchy there. But when it's not, it doesn't fall into the master-slave dynamic. That when it's said that Adam is Eve's head, it doesn't mean that he's a tyrant and she has no will. We've already seen that played out in Paradise Lost. In fact, he lets her go. Right? There's a discussion amongst them as if it was a king and queen deliberating the matter together, and in the end, he says, if you will not agree, if you will not consent, go, thy agreement or disagreement absents thee more. And she says, with thy permission then. So she's asking. And he's entertaining it as a possibility. So it's portrayed that way. She has a will, she has reason, but he ought to be, in the end, ruling over her and not letting this happen, and he lets it happen. So the chief, by the way,